Hello, my name's Alan Foom, and today I'm going to talk about sealing rocks, which is what keeps the hydrocarbons in the trap. A seal is a key part of the petroleum system. There are 5 elements in the petroleum system. First of all, you need a source rock, which is the rock which has got organic matter in it from which the oil is generated, for example a shale. The organic matter is generated by heat and burial and pressure, and then is forced out of the shale and migrates upwards through buoyancy. It'll either float to the surface, which will form an oil seep, or alternatively, it'll get trapped within a trap. Within a trap, it needs a reservoir rock to store it. This is a porous rock, such as a sandstone or a limestone. And to cap it all, you need a cap rock or a seal, which is what prevents the hydrocarbons from leaving the reservoir and floating on upwards. And the cap rocks or the seals are the hardest thing to predict within petroleum exploration. Now, do a lot of work on some of the other things. Trapping advanced seismic images. I'm a geophysicist. That's what I do. I interpret seismic data to provide information for traps. Also a little bit on the reservoirs with geophysical QI, qualitative interpretation, seismic anomalies, post-stack interpretation such as AVO, inversion, etc. But the geologists are the main leaders on that, working with sedimentology, stratigraphy, to try to build up a picture of how reservoir rocks are deposited. The source of migration story is taken care of by basin modeling, seep studies, geochemistry. All of that is put together to produce an integrated model of how fluids move. However, there are few truly effective techniques improving seal capacity. There's work that's being done, but there are no silver bullets, and we can only use the techniques to try to quantify the risk. Now, sealing rock failure is the major cause of dry holes in mature basins. It's a fairly significant cause of dry holes in other basins as well, but in mature basins, it's the main cause. In frontier basins, we don't really understand the reservoir distribution, we don't really understand the source system, may not always understand the trapping style, and therefore the geologists are testing new ideas, and the ideas only work about 10% of the time. So that's the normal success rate for wells in their frontier basins. So 90% of frontier exploration wells fail. The 10% more than make up for it, but 90% of them fail. In mature systems, we generally tended to have worked out the reservoir distribution, tended to have worked out the structural styles, tended to have worked out the petroleum system. We think we know what we're doing, but surprises still do happen. But seals are now the most likely reservoir cause for failing, for drilling dry holes. In a mature basin, you will drill about 35 or 40% of your exploration wells will be successful. So still, more than half, more than 60% will fail. This is a paper by Rudolph and Goulding, who used to work for Exxon, which is published in the APG Bulletin, main geotechnical journal, geological journal, American Association of Petroleum Geologists, in February 2017. And what they did here was compare the main causes of failure through new plays, i.e. frontiers, extending plays, which are maturing plays, which is Exxon terminology, and a fully mature play. And you can see here that in a brand new area, your petroleum system is the main risk. Because when you're going to a frontier, you don't really know. You may have some indications such as seeps or amplitude anomalies, etc., but you don't really know and you don't understand it. There's also a potential failure with the reservoirs. Again, you don't really know. As you become more mature in your understanding, the top two, the charge and the reservoir, tend to decrease because you have more data, you have more understanding, more knowledge. Still going to get surprises, but the seals become a much more important factor. So this paper, published February 2017. Now, what got me interested in talking about seals was a lecture by Jay Carlo, and it's available on YouTube, and I'll find it and put a link in the description. And he talked a little bit about Schlumberger's analysis of global wells. Again, seals a major cause failure. So this is worldwide. And the United Kingdom Continental Shelf, a mature area with which I'm very familiar, the Oil and Gas Authority, the main regulator in the UK, published an analysis of well failure, and including one of mine, which they published, and they looked at detail what went wrong. And again, here Seal was a major failure, and also to some extent reservoirs where people were going for new novel plays which didn't work out. So again, mature areas, seals are your main cause because we don't fully understand them. So mechanisms for seal failure. Again, this is based on Jay Carlo's lecture. So the top seal has got three main failure mechanisms. You've got microporosity, so some small pores within the seal which allow leakage. The capillary pressure is exceeded by the buoyancy of the hydrocarbons. So basically the hydrocarbons flow up through the small pores. If there's some tectonic movements, including faulting, a brittle top seal may fail through fractures developing within it. And also if the pore pressure, and I will talk about pressures in a minute, is very heavy, i.e. the pressure of the length of the hydrocarbon column, that can fracture the seal rock. There are two main failures within fault seals, which are shale smear, i.e. where you have not enough shale smearing along the fault plane to prevent hydrocarbons going up the fault plane, or cross-fault leakage where you have sand-on-sand contact. So here's a diagram explaining this. So this is a fault, this is your reservoir, yellow sandstone, and this is your top seal. So in this case, we have sand-on-sand contact. So to get to this contact, you have that particular bit of the fault plane has to be sealing, otherwise the hydrocarbons will just escape up here. In fault-related contact, this now becomes the weakest link. So although it's sand on clay, if the smearing isn't quite right, the fault becomes the weakest link and hydrocarbons might escape up the fault plane, or the clay smear may limit the amount of hydrocarbons that the trap can hold. Once you get past the top of the fault plane, this little area in here, you're reliant on the top seal only. So you've got one point of failure where you can have brittle rock failure, you can have hydraulic fracture failure if there's a big column within here where the top of the seal may break temporarily and hydrocarbons will leak off until equilibrium is restored. Or there may be tectonic movements that fracture the top. So those are the main seal failure mechanisms that exist. This you can do quite a bit of work to predict. This you can do some bit of work to predict. You can do a bit on this, but it's all rather uncertain. So the three main types of sealing cap rocks. The best one are evaporites, such as halite or rock salt. So this is when you have hypersaline waters, the water evaporates, leaves behind effectively something like the Bonneville salt flats. So something like that writ large. Now, nothing is going to get through that because the permeability of salt is very, very, very low. However, there's a risk that there might be windows where the salt is missing, which will allow local leakage. For example, when I was working in the pre-Caspian basin in Kazakhstan, you had Permian salt, you had Jurassic and Cretaceous reservoir on top of that, and they were charged through holes in the Permian salt. You also had Carboniferous and Devonian reservoirs underneath the Permian salt, and they were protected from leakage by the Permian salt. You can also have tight limestones and chalks. Worked in the central North Sea, the examples of fields which are sealed fundamentally by Cretaceous chalk, which has got very low porosities, virtually no permeability, and therefore that acts as your top seal. However, there might be remnant porosity within the chalk, and they're also vulnerable to brittle failure in a way that shales are a lot less vulnerable to. Most seals, however, are shales and mud rocks, but they're not all equal. So we've got an example here from a paper by Dawson, Orman and Dempster and Sutton from 2008. These are Chevron people, and I looked at different facies of types of shale. Now, mud rocks are not all the same. The best sealed mud rocks are laminated shales with very high clay content, very low carbonate, very low silt. As your contents of silt and carbonate decreases, your shales become less good. Also, mud rocks deposited during debris flows that don't have the lamination are less good in terms of seals. You can, however, be saved by the cementation. So I urge you to check out this paper by Dawson, Orman, Dempster and Sutton that describes all this in quite a lot of detail with experience that they have in Mexico, in Gulf of Mexico and West Africa. This is a very basic introduction to pressures. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, but I'll just go through the key factors that are there. So on the y-axis we have depth, so depth increases here, and pressure increases on the x-axis. This line here is the hydrostatic pressure gradient. So that's the pressure of water which increases with depth of burial. And this is the lithostatic pressure gradient, which is the pressure increase due to the weight of rock that's in there. The pore pressure is the pressure of the fluids within the pores. Now normally it'll be somewhere close to the hydrostatic gradient, but you could have overpressure because basically pressure could not escape due to rapid burial. You also have a hydrocarbon pressure gradient, which is the green line here. Now hydrocarbons have a steeper gradient than water, and because of the build-up of pressure from the hydrocarbons, they could intersect with something called a fracture gradient, which is the strength of the rock, where the rock can fracture to allow hydrocarbons through or any other fluids through. And when this interacts with each other, that's when you have a breakdown. Now you get this pressure from fluid testers, such as MDTs, within the porous zones. You get this pressure from leak-off tests, which you put when you put in your casing. So when you're planning a well, you will build a pressure diagram. The key point here is that you need to know where your pressures are, and if your pore pressure exceeds your fracture gradient, then your rock will fail. Obviously you need quite a lot of information to be able to do this, predict it successfully, because you need all this data from real wells, which is why it's so hard in frontier areas. But even in mature areas, sometimes you get it wrong. Talk very briefly about fault seals. Now there's a very good video by Graham Yielding, who's the main expert on this particular field. So I'll just basically summarize this very quickly. Faults can be interpreted in all sorts of ways, whether they're interpreted as seals, as conduits, whatever, to be honest, is suitable for some geologists' purposes. So what you do is you have contacts between rocks on different planes of the fault, and here we have some sandstones which are on one side of the fault linking up with sandstones on the other side of the fault, and when the two of them come side by side against each other, they will leak through. Now faults will smear clay, so basically when a fault moves, it drags some clay and smears it along the front of the surface, giving it a bit of a barrier. Now sometimes it could be a complete barrier that seals. On the other hand, it could be a barrier which forms a baffle, which forms a pressure cell. So you've got sometimes fields with different fault blocks that will have different contacts, hydrocarbon water contacts and different pressures, and this is why this happens. They may also break down on terms of production. Quite a complicated subject, but obviously something that needs to be looked at. Now, within companies, you've got different ideas about what faults do. So this is Exxon's and Shell's points of view. This is from J. Carlo. So faults gouge seals only in 10% of traps according to Exxon, where Shell believe they're quite common from their experience. Exxon don't feel they can predict it, where Shell think they can, or they have data which they make things fit. Exxon don't really believe in fault gouge. I mean, they think it's about interpretation, whereas Shell think that it's quite critical, particularly small faults. And they also feel that faults may support significant hydrocarbon heights. Shell do, whereas Exxon don't really feel that way. So both of those are published within internal studies between Exxon and Shell. But those sort of views tend to permeate within companies. So younger geologists tend to accept them. And very few people tend to challenge them. I personally think people ought to challenge things. Maybe right, maybe wrong, but ask them questions. So the key points. Effective seals are a vital part of the petroleum field. No seal, no field. That's it. But they're also the least well understood part of petroleum exploration, the hardest element of risk, and the key cause of dry holes in mature basins. So we need to think about seals. We need to think about how they work. There are some techniques that can think about sealing capacity of geologists, but they'll only really give you a better estimation. There are no silver bullets. There's always going to be risk. You're always going to have to live with that. But I think this is the real problem. Now I'm the rather plump geophysicist sitting on the bottom of the seesaw. A lot of time is spent interpreting seismic. You can get a lot of data out of seismic. You can get a lot of information that can guide everything else. But it takes up a lot of time, takes up a lot of manpower, and sometimes you don't have enough time to spend on everything else. You can't really build a lot of these things without a seismic data set, but we need to rethink that. So thank you very much.